Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
The market's finally tuned to react to any piece of economic data, including the JOLTS data from this morning as we await the jobs report on Friday. All of it, Joe, so that it can paint a clearer picture of what may happen with the trajectory of monetary policy, what the Federal Reserve will actually do at its meeting later this month. At the same time, though, here in Washington, we have major questions about fiscal policy, and we're getting more details as to what fiscal policy could look like under both of the potential presidencies of Harris and Trump 2.0.
Get ready for a lot of talk about tax cuts and tax policy here, maybe tax hikes in some areas. Kamala Harris looking to hike the corporate tax, which Wall Street has an allergy to inherently. Donald Trump, though, is talking about making permanent, of course, the fairly popular on Wall Street 2017 tax cuts. And the new analysis from Goldman Sachs paints a pretty ugly picture about what that would mean for deficit spending. Try $10.5 trillion over a decade. Technically, as we understand it now, and we do need more details on both campaigns' plans, Donald Trump is outspending Kamala Harris at this stage.
Although it is worth pointing out, she would like to do some tax cutting of her own. As she's going to outline today, she would like to reduce the number or the amount of taxes that small businesses have to pay by expanding the small business tax credit. Yeah,
we're going to hear from her around 2:45 Eastern time from the seacoast of New Hampshire. And along for the ride is Congressman Gabe, a Democrat from Rhode Island, who brought an historic candidacy to the Ocean State, the first black member of Congress in the state of Rhode Island, and now on the road for the Harris campaign. Congressman, welcome. You have a good sense, I think, of the audience listening in to this argument over taxes and the economy, because the guys hanging around Caserta Pizza in Providence have a lot in common with the guys hanging around the Puritan back room in Manchester, all of whom are going to be listening to this today. And it becomes almost a question, Congressman, of who do you believe? Who do you trust more with the economy? And Kamala Harris says it is her, despite the track record that Donald Trump has to put on the table. How does she appeal to the folks at the Puritan back room and Caserta Pizza who want to know if their taxes are going up?
Well, first off, thanks for having me. And I am glad that you are displaying your Rhode Island knowledge of Caserta, which is a great institution on Federal Hill right here in Providence. And I think ultimately this comes down to, who do you think has your best interests in mind? Who do you think wants opportunity for the many and not the few? And frankly, the proof is in the pudding. We have seen with the Trump tax cuts, the concentration of wealth at the top. Frankly, the middle class saw higher taxes, while with this opportunity agenda that Vice President Harris is putting forward, the announcement today is an example of that. 25 million new business registrations as the goal, working towards that startup expense, those expenses being deductible at a higher rate, tenfold, $50,000, where we know it costs on average of $40,000 to start a new business. So again, the question is, who is fighting for you and those in your lives so that everybody can have opportunity?
Well, Congressman, does there have to be a certain degree of honesty here about whether Kamala Harris can fight that fight alone? She's not going to be able to institute this policy or any others regarding the revenue and spending of this government without Congress control, right? And even if you and your colleagues can win back the majority, it's not looking as optimistic, perhaps, in the Senate.
Well, look, I am an optimist, and you know, the only poll that matters is that on Election Day. And so we're going to be working hard. I am cautiously optimistic that Speaker Hakeem Jeffries will be something that comes to fruition. I am also confident that we will be able to hold the Senate. Now, that's going to take a lot of work, and I think Vice President Harris's presence on the ticket has buoyed our potential, and I feel very strongly that the American people, when presented with these options of investing in an opportunity agenda. We heard previously last month on housing and in ensuring that everybody has the opportunity to own a home. today on growing small businesses and cutting red tape versus a double down on trickle down economics, making permanent, which has been one of the biggest increases in income disparity and wealth disparity in our country. That's the choice that Americans have. And I believe that most of them will side for everybody having a seat at the table and growing their pie.
Well, Congressman, we're down to, I believe it's 62 days to that final poll you referred to in November. How important is it for Kamala Harris? And I'll hear from all the Harris supporters on Twitter about this. We're asking the same about both campaigns. Does she have to detail how she's going to pay for all of her proposals?
Well, I think that's part of the process, and we are hearing that. I think over time, again, this campaign, as you noted, has 62 days left, 62 days to make a case to the American people and explain what we'll do regarding taxes, making sure that there is true tax fairness, that there is an opportunity for those companies who aren't paying their fair share to contribute in a fair, reasonable way to the strength and growth of our economy so that everybody can thrive. So those explanations are underway. And that is in contrast to what the former president has talked about in terms of giveaways to industry in exchange for support. That is not how this economy is meant to work. And I believe in the fairness that the vice president will pursue with her opportunity agenda will lay that out very clearly.
Of course, sir, it's not just a question of the kind of economic policy she'll pursue, but foreign policy as well, especially in light of the developments over the last few days in the Middle East, the death of 6 hostages that were being held by Hamas, ongoing pressure on the Netanyahu government and Hamas to agree to a ceasefire. I ask you this knowing you sit on the Foreign Affairs Committee. What does Kamala Harris need to say to the American people about the policy she will pursue when it comes to Israel and Gaza?
I think what you'll hear from the vice president is a clear and focused set of goals around achieving peace, ultimately a two-state solution. But in the near term, making sure that we get the negotiated end to hostilities and get hostages back, as well as provide a robust set of humanitarian responses to a situation that has turned into a cycle of violence where there is a deficit of hope. And so we'll continue to hear from the vice president and in her capacity. As you know, she has traveled around the world, met with hundreds of world leaders, executed a diplomatic agenda on behalf of the Biden-Harris administration. So she is one of the most experienced people to step into the Oval Office when she wins on a foreign policy, from a foreign policy perspective. So I expect her to lay out a continued commitment to diplomatic resolutions to tragic situations like one we're seeing in Gaza.
Well, Congressman Amo, we don't need to tell you that the issue surrounding Israel specifically has been a major point of concern for progressive Democrats who have been disappointed with the Biden administration's approach to helping to protect civilian lives, for instance, in Gaza. Will progressives be disappointed all over again when they realize that Kamala Harris has the same policy?
Well, I see that Democrats, by and large, are excited about Vice President Harris. And I think they will see that in her approach, which will be that she is driving, is going to be about finding solutions, bringing people together. There's a lot of divisiveness on this issue. This is not a political football. This is about lives. This is about people who are suffering, the poor hostage families who are, desperately seeking answers, and those who have lost so many in Gaza, so many Palestinians who, for no fault of their own other than the birth lottery, are suffering. And so I think you will see a compassion from her that is consistent with our values and will really speak to all of the concerns across the broad and big tent of the Democratic Party.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, Congressman, as you join us today from Rhode Island with Harris spending time in New Hampshire, if you could just speak to the state of play in New England overall. Is New Hampshire an area in which this campaign needs to devote time and resources? Is it actually something that's going to be a real contest in this cycle?
Well, look, nothing is a given in politics, and we were going to be working hard in New Hampshire. In fact, I've been there previously this cycle, spent time in Exeter and Manchester and Concord, and we'll go back to make the case to my New England neighbors that we have to work hard. This is not an election that is going to be a blowout. It's going to be close. We are the underdog. The vice president is the underdog. Make no mistake about it. But with all of the work that we will do, New England will go blue, and we will make sure that to send a clear message that we want an agenda focused on protecting our freedoms, expanding economic opportunity, and making sure this democracy can stand for the betterment of all Americans, especially all of the folks that I share New England with here in Rhode Island.
All right. Democratic Congressman Gabe Amo of Rhode Island, thank you so much for joining us today, sir. We appreciate your time.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
We want to stay now in New England and New Hampshire specifically. We're joined now by the Republican governor of New Hampshire, Chris Sununu. Governor, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. It's always great to have you, sir. I'd like to ask you the same kind of question I just asked of the congressman. Polling is now showing that the map is wider in terms of the swing states for Kamala Harris than it was for Joe Biden. The co-chair of the RNC, Laura Trump, told me just last week they're looking to spend more money in states like North Carolina and Pennsylvania. Would you be advising the Republican Party, the campaign specifically, to waste precious time and money in New Hampshire this time?
Well, without a doubt. I mean, look, if you look at the electoral map, a lot of these swing states are going to be close. New Hampshire is going to be very close. But if Kamala Harris were to win Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, the path to victory for Trump is North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, New Hampshire, right? So when you got to do the electoral math on this, and yeah, we might only have 4 electoral votes, but there's no doubt it's going to come into play. And this is a state that Trump only lost by 2,000 votes. 2,000 votes, that's nothing, back in 2016. And I think a lot of us agree that 2024 is going to look a lot more like 2016 in terms of the race. So I have no doubt that they will be putting resources here. Obviously, the former vice president thinks she needs to spend, the current vice president, Kamala Harris, needs to think that she needs to spend time here to earn and still have a chance to win this state. She's coming today. And I think you're going to see Trump coming and spending money here as well.
Hey, Governor, it's good to see you. This is the kind of stuff we live for. We just talked to a Harris surrogate, a Democratic member of the House of Representatives from New England, and it's a great opportunity to ask you, as Kailey said, some of the same questions to get a sense of where your head is. We associate you with traditional, dare I say, old-fashioned Republican conservative values, and I wonder what your thought is when it comes to some of the deficit spending that we're hearing about from both campaigns. The analysis from Goldman Sachs makes it pretty clear that the deficit spending that Bloomberg estimates would top $10 trillion over a decade to making permanent the Trump tax cuts would outweigh any other benefits of his tax proposal. Kamala Harris, I believe, is in the area of $2 trillion in deficit spending, with at least the amount that we have heard. And I know that you're not about to vote for the Harris campaign. Are you concerned about ballooning deficits as a conservative sitting in New Hampshire under a Trump 2.0?
I'm concerned about a blooming deficits in America, regardless of who's in. There's no question about that. I mean, let's be honest. Republicans in the House and the Senate have not held up the conservative fiscal values that the Ronald Reagans and the Chris Sununus really champion. So it's not just about Trump. It's about Congress. It's about actually a leadership on the Republican side in the Senate and in the House saying, hey, here's a proposal for a balanced budget. Here's how you do it. Here's the tough decisions to get it done. Now, under the potential Harris administration, as with Biden, it's been just an economic disaster on the macro scale. But more importantly, it's been a disaster on the microeconomic scale, being the rent, the cost of living, the fact people can't afford their electricity bills. They panic about how they're going to put food on the table. I mean, those are real issues. Inflation isn't 3.9%. That's not how people look at it. Inflation is more like 25 to 35% compounded since the last administration. And that's what people are going to look at. I could afford things 4 years ago. I can't afford them now. They're going to go to the ballot box and they're going to vote on those issues of that financial stress, that anxiety, if you will, that stuff that keeps them up at night. That's what drives a voter. And that 10 to 12% of swing voters that are still out there, that's far and away the number one issue. Not so much on the macroeconomic scale. I get nervous about that. But day to day, family to family, it's all about how we're going to pay our bills and who's the agent of change. Clearly not the current administration, right? You're just going to get the same, if not worse, in terms of economic policies, price controls and all that nonsense. But the agent of change to actually make people's lives more affordable. And that's going to be Donald Trump.
Well, Governor, is that really true, though, if he's talking about blanket tariffs on everything that the U.S. Brings in, perhaps 60% on goods from China, the world's second largest economy? Any economist would tell you that is inflationary policy. If this is really about the cost of goods, that doesn't mean they're going lower under Trump.
Yeah, look, I completely agree. I don't love the tariff policies that he's putting forward, but again, that's strategy, right? That's kind of the leverage you want to use from America's position as the world leader and as the economic leader in the world to force better decisions and better results out of China and ultimately even Europe and the rest of Asia. So again, the Biden administration has ignored it, right? They haven't done anything on any of these issues. They're letting China grow more powerful. To understand what's going on in these international economies and to kind of threaten those tariffs, to threaten some sanctions and things of that nature, to gear up better international negotiations on what, ultimately what, not just the tariffs, but what other regulatory barriers should be there so they're not stealing our IP and all of that. I'll say this, none of that's going to matter when it comes to the vote. It's really not. When it comes to whether people vote for Trump or Harris, that's kind of a 30,000-foot level issue. People are going to vote on their anxieties. It's the border, but not about the 11 million illegals coming in. That's bad enough. I mean, we can't stand that. But it's the drugs they're bringing in. It's the human trafficking issue. You're right, to take those macro issues and have a candidate, and that's what you're going to hopefully see in the debate, these candidates bring it down to a real level of what parents are struggling about and what parents are driving their anxieties on, if you will, on cost of living and drugs, how it affects their families. That's what's going to really be the selling point that I think Trump has to get by and kind of sell to the people, if you will, because I do think that Republicans have the right answers. They have real results. It's not just, hey, I'm not Joe Biden. I mean, that's literally all the Kamala Harris campaign has right now. That's not enough to cross the finish line in these swing states come November 5th.
Well, she's proposing some small business tax incentives in your state today, Governor, which is why she's gone there. But the analysis that we got from Alec Phillips at Goldman Sachs does leave us scratching our heads a bit. He estimates if Donald Trump wins, the hit to growth from the tariffs we're discussing right now, assuming they're 20 percentage points across the board, and tighter immigration policy would outweigh the positive fiscal impulse and result in something in the area of a 0.5 percentage point of GDP. If the experts on Wall Street are telling us that deficit spending will increase inflation and that this Trump plan will slow economic growth, how does that help anybody with their anxiety about high prices?
Because Kamala Harris is proposing price controls, which would absolutely crush the economy, which would absolutely crush any sense of entrepreneurship, would absolutely crush the stock market, reduce any sense of and then you add on that we're going to tax you on unrealized gains, right? That crushes the stock market, right? That basically says anyone who's making major investments to companies that ultimately grow and employ people, that all comes to a screeching halt. Kamala Harris's policies, she had an opportunity to actually go to the middle, but she went even more extreme than Joe Biden. So Joe Biden has, in his administration, has completely destroyed this economy and people's ability to afford anything. She goes even further left than that government is going to now control prices and destroy any sense of entrepreneurship or innovation in any of these new markets, allowing just basically a couple giant companies to control things. And it actually ends up in causing a massive reverberation in a negative way throughout this entire economy. So, I mean, the scary point that you're not bringing up and that article doesn't address is the fact that the Democrats and these they're not even Democrat policies, they're extreme liberal policies, would be devastating to the average American in terms of what they can afford.
Governor, I'd like to ask you about a well-read piece today, and it's Jonathan Martin's new column in Politico magazine. The headline reads as follows: if Republicans want to win, they need Trump to lose big. It's this notion that members of your party, at least off the record, are suggesting it actually would be net beneficial in the medium term, shall we say, for Donald Trump to lose this election. What do you think about that idea? Would it be better for the party?
No, of course not. Look, so with all due respect, of course, anytime you have a president in office, the opposite party has an opportunity in the midterm elections. That's been tried and true for 100 years. Doesn't mean it's an automatic win for them, but that typically is just how it works. So, with all due respect to Jonathan, I love the guy, but he's not saying anything that is really news. And other than the fact that if he says that party insiders, look, I hate to tell you, I'm a governor. I'm a pretty popular governor, and I'm kind of on the inside. And I talk to other governors, I talk to other politicians all the time. Nobody's talking about that. No, not at all. Because what matters? What's going to get America better in a better place down the road? Results matter. And the Trump administration, as an administration, can start delivering real results, bringing cost of living down, trying to deal with the drug crisis, the border crisis. And if you get those results, that's a huge win for Republicans that want to run in 2026 or even 2028. So, no, I disagree with the premise completely. I do believe results matter. And I can honestly tell you, no one's talking about that on the inside of the political bubble, so to say. Everybody is kind of galvanizing around making sure we get a Republican ticket. And look, whether you like Trump or not, what you get with Trump is a Republican administration. A new Republican head of the EPA. The current head of the EPA is an absolute disaster. A new Republican head of DOT. A new Republican head of education. All these departments that make rules and a lot of the processes that all of us have to live by. So that Republican administration is going to be a huge win for America. Even if you don't like the way Trump, acts and what he says, I don't like any of that. But boy, that change in holistic style out of D.C. Is going to be hugely beneficial for this country. I mean, walk into any building in Washington, D.C. right now. Nobody's there. They all work remotely. The federal government works at a snail's pace of a snail's pace because nobody actually comes to work. Right? It's incredible what the Biden administration has done to D.C., bringing the whole process to gridlock. So you're not just voting for Trump. You're voting for a whole change in approach to government where, again, you as the individual come first. States' rights matter. Local individual control is actually important again. Those are the things.
Well, I'll tell you what, Governor, I live in Washington. I was in traffic for over an hour this morning. I think somebody's coming to work down here, but you probably saw your name in this column. Before we let you go,
all the lobbyists,
I read here, consider the governors, Glenn Youngkin, the lobbyists, well, maybe the reporters too, Brian Kemp, and yes, New Hampshire's Chris Sununu, it says, would all be prime targets for Senate Republicans. I thought you already decided that was a bad idea, that nothing gets done here.
You mean in terms of me? Right? No, I have no interest in running for the U.S. Senate at all. No, nothing does get done in D.C. It's incredibly frustrating. Governors get stuff done. We get results. We stand accountable. We stand behind the wins and the losses, and that's what good government's all about. So, no, I was once ranked, the most. We had a ranking of the most efficient government in the country here in New Hampshire, which is like being the best surfer in Kansas. I get it, but. It is something that we do take pride in, and compared to D.C., it's been an epic disaster. So no, thank you. I've done my 4 terms. I'm going to go off into the private sector, and happy to help anybody learn how to win races on the private side of things that I can.
Just think of the conversations we'll be able to have when he's out of office, Kailey. Governor, it's great to see you. We invoked the Puritan's back room before you came on the air. Say hi to everybody for us in Manchester. Chris Sununu, of course, the governor of New Hampshire.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
We carry on here the Wednesday edition of Balance of Power. Boy, this week is moving quick. I actually thought, like you, it was Tuesday earlier. Coming off the long holiday weekend, Kamala Harris, as you just learned, clearly going to be in New Hampshire talking economy earlier. But then it's on to Pittsburgh. This is interesting, Kailey. Reports earlier today on debate prep in the Washington Post. She's going to be holding her final days of prep hunkered down in Pittsburgh, not Camp David or at home, for instance. And she's going to get there Thursday and stay for the rest of that period of time, I guess, sequestered, so there are no distractions.
Yep, staying in Pennsylvania, and then she'll make the journey from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia, where the debate will take place, of course, on ABC on September 10th. We're going to have full coverage of that, of course, alongside our signature political panel, Rick Davis and Jeanne.
That's right. Let's bring him in right now, our panel today with debate prep in mind. And, of course, Rick Davis is someone who knows a lot about that, having prepared multiple candidates through murder boards, as they called them, getting through the prep and trying to simulate the debate that they're going to endure next Tuesday. Rick, we understand Philip Raines again will be playing Donald Trump in full cosplay here. I don't know if he's got the wig on or not, but he's wearing lifts and doing things to make it look like he's Donald Trump. To what extent do you like this idea? Because I know that you were concerned about Joe Biden's prep. Some suggested he was over-prepared to go to a different city, to hunker down with your advisors and get ready.
Yeah, I think that practice is a good thing. It's been a while since Kamala Harris was on a debate stage in a competitive environment, and this is the big show. So I think she's doing the right thing by hunkering down and bringing her team in and putting Raines into a red tie again. The more familiarity that you have with the stage and the surroundings and the lighting, the easier it's going to be for you to get into sort of a thinking mode, right? And we've talked about this before about debates, but these debaters get nervous. I mean, this is the biggest thing she's going to have done since her convention speech, and maybe the most important moment of her political career. And tell me she's not going to have butterflies. And so getting used to the scenes and sounds and action on a stage with lights in your face and knowing you only have a certain amount of time to respond, I think is wise to acclimatize the candidate to this.
Well, as you talk about the sounds, Rick, it also might be worth noting the sounds that won't be heard, at least to the audience, because according to the debate rules released by ABC, the mics will be muted when it's not the candidate's turn to talk, as they were in the CNN debate between Trump and Biden back in June. Even despite the Harris campaign's protestation over that, they would like the mics to stay hot. Jeanne, how is that likely to change the actual preparation that is underway? You don't necessarily need to work on something akin to the I'm speaking that we saw in the Harris-Pence debate in 2020 if he can't speak while you're speaking, right?
That's right. And we all remember she spent a lot of that debate trying to, hush up is the best way to put it, Mike Pence. This is a margin of error election. This debate couldn't be more important for both of them. And I keep thinking that if there's one thing that Kamala Harris should do, you guys remember the movies A Few Good Men with Tom Cruise and Jack Nicholson on the stand? She's got to entice Donald Trump to lose his mind. You can't handle the truth style. And that's what she's got to do over and over again. To your point, Kailey, the muting is not going to help her with that. I'm old enough to remember the Rick Lazio-Hillary Clinton debate here in New York, which was a local debate. But she's got to entice him to do that over and over again, because people have to be reminded who Donald Trump is and the fact that he can't control himself when he's goaded into saying things. And that's where I would encourage her to go. We know she's methodical and preparing, so I'm hoping that's where she has focused her attention, but she'll be holed up in Pennsylvania doing this for so many days.
You need me on that wall, Jeanne. The thing is, it may not be fully baked, Rick. I don't know what you guys think of this. The Harris campaign is telling NBC News that they have not agreed to the debate rules involving that muted microphone that Kailey just mentioned, that they're still, in fact, hashing out several key issues, including the muting of microphones when it's not their turn to speak. Rick, what do you make of this? Are we going to see this debate continue, the debate about the debate, until next Tuesday?
Yeah, there's some gamemanship going on here, too. As much as Donald Trump doesn't want to show that she's getting under his skin, it was just a couple of days ago he went on this rant about, of course he could do it with the microphones on, but they already agreed the microphones are going to be off. And I'm sure they took that statement and said, well, if he's agreed that the microphones can be on, then our preference is to do that, and just keep them all tangled up. I think tactically there are so many of these beneath the public perception of things that are going on, just to get under his skin. And by the way, I think that's really going to be her approach in the debate. I don't think she's going to try to define Donald Trump. He's the most defined person maybe on the face of the earth. You're not going to chip into that a lot, but she does want to get under his skin and maybe elicit one of those, moments that Jeanne talks about where you can't handle the truth comes out. Now, in his case, it's probably more like you can't handle my lies. But that's a totally different situation.
Well, and in our final minute here, we, of course, had a conversation with the two of you yesterday about the idea that the election may be on November 5th, but voting starts at the end of this week when absentee ballots start getting mailed out in North Carolina on Friday. Is it possible that there will be people out there who have already made up their minds, Jeanne, before seeing either of these candidates on the stage next week?
Absolutely. And, I think, in fact, as we look at the data, we only have about 5 to 10% of people who haven't made up their minds and who are still what we would consider persuadable. So it is a small number, but in an election this tight, that is a critical number. And so this matters an awful lot, even though, to your point, early voting is starting imminently. It's very exciting, Kailey. It's our time of year.
Yes, it is. Jeanne, Zaino, and Rick Davis, of course, with us through all of the exciting twists and turns in this election cycle, our signature political panel. Thank you both so much for joining us here on Balance of Power.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
As we carry on with our conversation about politics, we want to stay on the markets for just a moment with some breaking news. Kailey, coming from the Wall Street Journal, I'm guessing the markets will like this because it appears no matter who wins the presidential election, we could see the top level capital gains tax go down. If you're looking for sunlight between Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, when it comes to the economy, we may have just found it, Kailey. She's going to talk about this in roughly 1 hour in New Hampshire.
Yeah, the Wall Street Journal citing people familiar with the matter here that suggests that she is planning to propose a less drastic increase to the capital gains tax rate. It does not specify whether this is on unrealized gains, which, of course, has been a point of dispute and heavily criticized by Republicans. According to the Journal's reporting, they've been discussing this move as they believe the Biden proposal put the rate too high. Yes. And a more modest rate increase could potentially encourage investment in entrepreneurship and access to capital for small businesses. And of course, it's small businesses and a tax credit expansion for them that Harris is planning on focusing on today.
Pretty interesting stuff here. They think it'll encourage more investment. As you mentioned, entrepreneurs will key off of this, and that's kind of the theme today. She's talking about small businesses, small business incentives, tax incentives, Kailey, that add to what we've already heard about her plans involving price gouging and housing incentives. We're slowly constructing what this economic proposal will be.
Yeah, and that's, of course, as we focus not just on economic policy, but the domestic policy that these candidates would like to pursue more broadly. But there's foreign policy questions as well. They'll likely field some of these on the debate stage in Philadelphia next Tuesday as they get ready to prepare for their answers. And, of course, front and center within the Democratic Party specifically, the area in which there is perhaps the most tension around foreign policy is on the subject of Israel and its ongoing war in Gaza, especially in light of the death of 6 hostages over this past weekend. The U.S., of course, putting increased pressure on the Israeli government to reach a ceasefire. And earlier today on Surveillance, one of the members of that government, the Israel Strategic Affairs Minister, Ron Dermer, joined our colleagues and had this to say.
In the wake of the horrific execution of 6 hostages, including an American, Hersh Goldberg Poland, Israel is not going to make concessions in the wake of that. We are committed to a deal. We set people to sit with negotiators to try to get that deal done. And I hope we can do it. We're working with the U.S. administration to try to push that deal forward. Until we have an actual practical solution on the ground for the Philadelphia corridor, Israel forces cannot leave.
For more on this, we're joined now by Mara Rudman. She is professor at the Miller Center at the University of Virginia, also director of the Ripples of Hope project focused on democratic solutions. Professor Rudman, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. It's great to have you. Obviously, we are all trying to figure out how the calculus around a ceasefire agreement has changed in the aftermath of this weekend's events. Thousands of protesters we have seen take to the streets in Israel. Do you think the odds are greater now than they were before this happened, that an agreement is reached, or lower?
Thanks, Kailey. Good to be with you again for this important discussion. Listen, I think the odds have been hard all along, and they continue to be so, because both Bibi Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister, and Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas and the mastermind of the horrendous Hamas action against Israel starting October 7th, but planned well before, themselves do not have an interest in getting to a ceasefire. Many Palestinians in Gaza do. Many Palestinians in the West Bank do, as well as certainly Egypt, Qatar, who are working that. And the same is true within Israel, of the many Israelis taking to the street to push for a ceasefire. And Prime Minister Netanyahu's own defense minister has made very clear that he thinks it's important and critical for Israel's interest to go forward. But two key decision makers are very tough to turn on this, and Netanyahu seems to have doubled down. I think Sinwar's been in a tough place for a while now.
Well, we heard from Netanyahu earlier this hour, Mara, and he made clear, reaching directly for the sticking point here, that Israel must stay along the Egypt-Gaza border in a first phase of a ceasefire, the Philadelphia corridor that we've been hearing so much about. As long as that's the case, there's no ceasefire, right?
Well, that's Netanyahu's position as articulated by Ron Dermer, who, of course, was ambassador to the United States, has been a close ally of Netanyahu for some time. I know Ron Dermer. I've worked with him when I served in President Obama's administration. And he's a political guy. The person who has actually got their portfolio and responsibility on Israel's security needs and what's most important for Israel's security is the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, who has made it very clear and has been public about it, that he believes that Israel is best protected by bringing hostages home and not physically controlling the Philadelphia corridor, that he believes there are many other routes to also provide for the security that Ron Dermer talked about on Prime Minister Netanyahu's behalf. So I think if the primary focus is what's in Israel's interest and bringing hostages home and Israel's security, it goes to some compromises that I believe have been on the table or are on the table about the Philadelphia corridor. It should be clear, it's not at all obvious that even if Netanyahu agrees, that Yahya Sinwar is prepared to agree.
Well, and of course, it's not just Sinwar and Netanyahu and their governments or their, in the case of Hamas, the organization that's at the table. There's mediators involved in this too, including the U.S., but Egypt and Qatar as well. Are there more that any of these mediating groups could be doing to force this deal to happen, or is everyone out of leverage here?
I think neither of your two statements, Kailey, are true. In other words, no, I do not think things are any of the countries involved are out of leverage. You're never done until you're done on this kind of issue, and it is hard for all the reasons we've discussed. But I also believe that the United States with Israel and in partnership with Egypt, the Egyptians and the Qataris, who I believe are working every point of leverage they have with Hamas, are doing absolutely everything they can and will continue to do everything that they can until there is a breakthrough on this. There is no giving up on this issue. There cannot be.
How long is the window open, though, in all reality, Mara, for Benjamin Netanyahu specifically? And if he announces a ceasefire here, what will it mean for his political career?
Well, listen, this is the reason that Netanyahu and Sinwar, and I don't mean to keep comparing them, but the challenge is you have two key decision makers who don't share the interests of everyone else involved. For Netanyahu, when this conflict ends, he is almost certainly done politically. There will be a state investigation that is, by the way, run by the Supreme Court of Israel, with whom he has not exactly had the best relationship since he tried to essentially dismantle their power. And the court, the judiciary, is the one who decides how the State Commission of Inquiry runs, which will be to investigate everything that's happened in Israel that led up to October 7th and the aftermath of how it's been prosecuted as well. And politically, if he agrees to a ceasefire, it means that he loses the two wildly extreme members of his coalition who have been guaranteeing his pathway to power. So this is part of putting the interests of his country ahead of his own personal interests. It's central here. And thus far, not something he's been willing to do, though he and Ron Dermer and others wrap it in a lot of other language.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, Mara, before the events of this weekend, we were focusing our conversation on Israel's preemptive strikes into or against Hezbollah and others as they are trying to avoid retaliation or intercept retaliation from both Hezbollah and Iran for events earlier this summer, the assassinations of Hamas's political leader in Tehran and, of course, a Hezbollah commander near Beirut. Does that take the Israeli eye off the ball, if you will, of those potential threats that could be coming in from other Iranian proxies or Iran itself that aren't Hamas? How does especially the domestic pressure at home for Netanyahu influence what kind of other events could transpire on other borders?
Well, listen, all of these events are in one way or another interrelated. Getting to a ceasefire in Gaza will help to reduce the reasons that, some of what is behind Hezbollah's attacks on Israel and the northern border. It will help to dial that down as opposed to dialing it up. And also, if you could actually go forward with the types of proposals the United States has been working, for example, with the Saudis, to get to a way forward for the Palestinians, which will absolutely be the next steps from a ceasefire. You need to have some way for the West Bank to restabilize and for Gaza to be built back. You need to have other forces around the region come in. They will not do that without some agreement from Israel to move forward, to begin to discuss the future of a Palestinian state, not to agree to one tomorrow, but to have some pathway forward that can allow for reforms for Palestinians and leaders that will be able to represent them going forward. I bring this up in the context of your question about the regional conflicts, because having Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the Qataris in one way or another, all aligned, as well as other countries in the region, will help to push back on the threat that Iran poses as well. There's elements of the deal the Saudis would strike with the United States that would help Saudi security, help regional security, give the United States more strength vis-a-vis Iran, and frankly, put Israel in a more secure position. So all of these elements are interlinked.
Mara, it's always a real pleasure to have you. Mara Rudman, professor at the Miller Center at the University of Virginia. We thank you, as always.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Welcome to the Wednesday edition. I know you think it's Tuesday. I did that this morning as well on Bloomberg Radio, with a special greeting to our listeners in Boston, finding us now on 92.9 FM. It's great to be part of the conversation, of course, in Boston, but also on satellite radio and on YouTube, where you can find us right now. Search Bloomberg Business News Live. With our eyes on the campaign trail, as always, and as I refer to our listeners in Boston, a little close to home, Kamala Harris heading to the great seacoast of New Hampshire. Yes, there is one. Northampton, New Hampshire. God, imagine what they'll be doing at the Hampton Beach Casino Ballroom when she rolls out the economic plan. That's not her venue. She's actually going to do this at a brewery in Northampton, New Hampshire. Small business policy plans, the theme today. We already heard some broad strokes in terms of price gouging and the housing market from Kamala Harris. She's going to fill in a few more blanks according to the campaign today. That happens 2:45 p.m. Eastern time, so that'll be in the late edition of Balance of Power when we get some details. Donald Trump holding a town hall, at least as it's being called. It's a Fox show. Sean Hannity doing that later on. They're recording it in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and it airs later tonight. Also in Pennsylvania, Tim Walz. He's in Lancaster and Pittsburgh today with campaign events. Not a mystery, as these two campaigns carve out travel plans, having spent Labor Day in the three swing states. And here we are again, back in Pennsylvania and in New Hampshire, too. A lot of questions about campaign resources in New Hampshire. We're going to talk in our second hour with Governor Chris Sununu a bit about that. But let's dig into the economy here. The plans by both of these campaigns that are going to drive voters when they hit the polls, I'd say in November, but even some by mail as soon as this week. Enda Curran joins, Bloomberg global economy reporter, with an awfully important story today on the Trump tax cuts that we're going to get into. Enda, it's great to see you. Small business, a good talker for Kamala Harris, getting in front of people today. She's talking about incentives for small business owners, not necessarily consumer themes that she's been hitting, like the price of groceries, et cetera.
Small business is the backbone of this economy. They're the biggest employer of workers in this economy. Small business creation has been on a boom over the past few years because of the way things have shifted a bit due to the pandemic and everything else. So it's probably pretty smart to identify that part of the economy for maybe offering tax relief and other measures to stoke growth and competition there. I should say, skeptics say, though, that a lot of these small businesses register, they start, but ultimately, do they turn a profit?
Yeah.
And how many workers do they keep in the payroll? But, it's been a good news story over the past few years.
A tenfold increase in the small business tax deduction for startup costs. Bloomberg got hands on some of the finer points on the tax proposals here that she'll outline later, increasing that deduction from $5,000 to $50,000. It's interesting as she's trying to become more business friendly in the face of Donald Trump, isn't it?
More business friendly because there's a feeling she might be tougher on bigger businesses, for example, higher corporate tax rate, for instance. But it does feed into the fiscal story again with both candidates. In this case, talking about Vice President Harris, question marks around, how will it be funded? How much will this add to the deficit? Some estimates over economic policy so far, tallying up maybe around $2 trillion mark. That's the Penn-Wharton budget model, for example. So when you see the small business tax measures, well, it kind of adds to the idea that, hold on a sec, there's a little bit of a bill adding up here. There's going to have to be some offsets made clear for that as well.
Well, and that goes for both campaigns, of course. I talk about this a lot. Neither campaign has really illustrated how they will pay for things outside of very broad strokes. Trump says we'll grow out of it. Kamala Harris is going to soak the rich, but you need Congress to play along to make both of these happen, certainly when it comes to allocating dollars. And you're looking at a really important item today when it comes to the Trump tax cuts. One of the most read stories today on the terminal. Trump tax cuts would cost more than almost all federal agencies. $10.5 trillion, you write, and over a decade, would exceed the combined budgets of every domestic federal agency. How is that conservative?
Yeah, so along with my colleague Eric Wasson, a rough tally of what they're talking about in the Trump campaign. As you mentioned, there is the $5-odd trillion for extending the tax cuts, $3-odd trillion for a child tax credit that his running mate J.D. Vance has talked about. Then there's the rest, like the no tax on tips, lower corporate tax, social security exemption. Point is, it's adding up to some pretty big numbers there at a time when people are warning about the fiscal trajectory, saying the deficit needs to be reined in, spending needs to be reined in. Now, of course, the Trump campaign makes it very clear these measures are pro-growth, will generate revenue for the government, and it will be offset in that way. But there are plenty of analysts in the middle who are warning both about this policy and the fiscal trajectory in general, saying, hang on, you're going to have to find some savings here, or at the very least find some offsets to get things back on track.
So is this debate next Tuesday night going to be a contest of who can outspend the other?
Well, the gap is still pretty large between both. I mean, as I say, there's a couple of trillion adding up on the Harris side, but the trillions are really adding up in the Trump campaign when it comes to where the big ticket stuff are. And that's what the analysts are saying early in this campaign. A lot depends, though, what shape will Congress be in?
Yeah.
What will Congress pass? I mean, there's a million and one ways some of this will or will not be passed yet. So, but in terms of campaign sort of conjecture on the road, the big ticket stuff is mostly falling on the Trump side of things right now.
By the scale of trillions. Remarkable. Enda, great work. Thank you so much for joining, as always. It's one of the smartest we have in the Bureau. Enda Curran, Bloomberg's global economy reporter. Find this story on the terminal now. It's a good read, and there's a lot more information that we didn't have a chance to get to. This is the kind of coverage that we promise here on Bloomberg. Yes, we talk about the horse race, but the policy proposals here that in many cases are leaving voters wanting are something that we're exploring with a very fine point here. We'll have more on this, by the way. Kamala Harris again speaks a few hours from now. Donald Trump, I suspect, will be asked about his plans when he talks to Fox and Sean Hannity a little bit later on. Again, much like yesterday, this is all playing out against the backdrop of what's taking place in Israel right now, and none of this is coming easily. As negotiators work toward a ceasefire, even as Benjamin Netanyahu prepares to address the public, he's due to give a speech right now. In fact, I've got my eyes on the headlines here on the terminal to see if he's going to make any news. Clearly not inspired to move forward on a ceasefire with the terms that are being put forth, including a withdrawal from the Philadelphia corridor along the Egyptian border. Now, we can talk about this from a lot of different angles. We've brought on military strategists. We've brought on political experts. Today, we want to bring on a peacemaker. And this is an important conversation. Gidi Grinstein is the former secretary and coordinator of the Israeli delegation for the negotiations with the PLO in 1999 through 2001. Gidi, it's great to have you here. I appreciate your time today. And as someone who has sat at the negotiating table, I wonder what your advice is for Benjamin Netanyahu as he prepares to speak.
Wants a deal or not. If he wants a deal, he has to rely on the Qatari and the Egyptian intermediaries because they have the leverage on Hamas. Egypt because it controls the border, and Qatar because of the financing and because of the fact that it hosts the Hamas leadership in Doha. Those are the two leverages that Israel has from the diplomatic side. On the ground, I think that Hamas has put Israel in a bind because Israel's maneuvering on the ground to push Hamas is actually led to the death of a number of hostages. So Israel is now extremely cautious in terms of being able to use its military power on the ground. But really, it comes down to the politics. Does Netanyahu want a deal or not? A deal like that may compromise his coalition with the far-right parties. It may also lead him down a path of additional, very difficult political decisions, which may destabilize his coalition and effectively bring his tenure to an end.
That's my next question. Does a ceasefire deal represent the end of Benjamin Netanyahu's political career?
Not necessarily. I mean, let's speak first about the current tenure and the current government and then about his political career. Ideally, I believe that Netanyahu would have wanted to end this current tenure with some sort of a move where he does what is necessary in order to allow for what is called the Saudi deal to unfold. He goes, at that moment, he says when he says whatever needs to be said about the Palestinians, about the political horizon that includes some sort of a very uncommitting statement about Palestinian statehood. At that point, he loses the far-right factions of his coalition. He goes to election as the person that brought the normalization with Saudi, the person that fought hard with the Palestinians, relentless fighting against Hamas, and was still nonetheless able to bring a normalization deal with Saudi, which is really a tremendous historical achievement. That, I think, is the ideal scenario in which Netanyahu goes to election. Of course, if he ends up being when President Trump is elected and is the incoming president or already in the White House, that for Netanyahu is the ultimate scenario.
Okay. That said, what role should and what role is Egypt playing in this process?
So Egypt has been the anchor of the stability in the region for almost 50 years, since the 1970s. Effectively, the 1973 war, which led to the 1974 disengagement agreements, which led to the 1978-1979 Camp David Accords and the Israel-Egypt peace treaty, has turned Egypt into an anchor of stability in the region. Of course, there are a lot of qualifications around that, and Sinai has not been as stable and quiet as everybody would have wanted. But generally speaking, almost everything that Israel was able to do in Gaza and with the Palestinians in Gaza, including since Hamas took over Gaza in June 2007, has been through the Egyptians and with the Egyptians. Later on, also the Qataris came on board. We have to understand that Israel and Hamas, and I repeat, Hamas, not the Palestinian Authority, have a legacy of back-channel negotiations, agreements, and understandings that included prisoner exchange, including opening the border, including all sorts of security arrangements. So that has been sort of working through the Egyptian channel for many years until now. Obviously, everything collapsed on October 7, but until now, Egypt has been sort of a cornerstone for all the arrangements in the region. And over again, whenever Israel and Hamas sort of deteriorated into an exchange of military blows, Hamas shooting rockets or sending terrorists into Israel and Israel attacking in retaliation in Gaza, it was the Egyptians who were able to stabilize the situation and bring back the ceasefire.
You mentioned, Gidi, the hostages. 6 hostages found dead, freshly assassinated as the IDF moved in to rescue them over the weekend. Of course, they included one American. There seems to be confusion over what impact this will have on the negotiating process. If you ask the Biden administration, they say it heightens the urgency and need for a ceasefire. Benjamin Netanyahu seems to be on the other side of that coin. It proves, he says, that Hamas cannot be trusted. What do you think?
I think obviously those two forces are working in opposite direction. On Netanyahu, there are tremendous pressures from the right not to do a hostage deal, or at least to put conditions and terms for a hostage deal that would make such a deal effectively impossible. They don't want a ceasefire. They don't want any kind of a political process. They're very concerned that even if Hamas is defeated and removed out of power, that Gaza and the West Bank will be unified again as a single territorial unit, what we used to call a single territorial unit, which then would open the way for the reinstitution of the Oslo Accords. All these are nightmare scenarios for the right-wing parties, and that's why they understand that if the hostage deal doesn't happen, none of the other things can happen. On the other side, you have very powerful factions in Israel, including the military, the defense establishment, and many others that are saying, we have to do the deal now, we deal with the consequences later. Today, the chief of staff, the commander of the Israeli military said, every hostage that comes back alive today will have decades of life. Every terrorist that will go back to Gaza will eventually be killed. So basically, this is his way of saying, let's do the deal, let's move on. We have to remember also that the fact that these hostages are in Gaza, it really compromises the ability of the military to maneuver freely in Gaza and to carry out military operations.
Understood.
And Hamas has been quite
Gidi,
smart
I'm sorry,
about it.
I'm out of time. Gidi Grinstein, thank you so much, Gidi. I apologize for interrupting.
Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.